So let's advance this idea of modern human impacts on the environment in the Anthropocene. Obviously, humans are focused on economic development, and it comes at a cost to the environment and ecosystems, which may be unsustainable. So this is a quote from Dr. Anwar A. Abdullah, who was at least a advisor on sustainability to the Prime Minister in Kurdistan regional government. So what does he have to say? In fact, the merging breakdown between modern economic development and surrounding ecosystems could be reached back to the deep past of our civilization. So we have always been like this, because there's been a debate about whether hunter-gatherers were somehow more environmentally friendly than the agricultural modern human being, and some argue that that's not necessarily true. Since the early building of Mesopotamian city walls and of the French Revolution, mankind has suffered from the illusion of nations, each against all other and all in all against nature. Here nature is considered as stock of economic goods, while the rising societies of what has become known as nations of mighty urban civilizations have infected their technological must upon silent flora and fauna. Paradoxical themes like these do reflect indeed the instability of cultural orientation and of rather a permanent expression of mastery of man and nature is little else but of master and slave, and thus to acquire a place on earth each nation has to justify its means of mastery over the rest. Men and nature, whilst to feel right even when doing wrong. Here the silent song of nature has never been subjected to a heartily detection, nor its quality is praised beyond the claim of dry equations. So the current dilemma seems to almost as a deep clash between nation and nature, and still nature has its own stratagems as to absorb our blows and fool us, whilst turning them upon mankind in utter wrath. Okay, so there is this idea of whether, as I mentioned in some other podcast and discourse earlier, whether humans were given domain over what God has created, or whether we are the stewards of the environment, or is it God's business to take care of the environment. These religious tenets and mores, whatever you want to call them, get mixed in with the ideas of what our role is in exploiting nature and its bounties. Physicist Dr. Ursula Franklin states here from 2008, if you look at the world as it is now, nobody is in their right mind intended it to be like that, and it's not solely lack of foresight, of which there is a lot, but also of genuine lack of understanding of how things actually work. And that is not stupidity, but it is the limitation of what the human mind can grasp. It wasn't that someone single-handedly delivered the mess in a plain brown envelope. It evolved as nature's response to, step-by-step, stupid decisions and responses not read. It's as if nature constantly sent emails and nobody opened them of those that could. Humans are only a very small part of nature. In certain ways, humans function best the better they understand the workings of nature and the more they respect it. They have the right, as every creature has, to modify nature so that they survive. That's why some birds migrate and some birds stay, and that's a perfectly rightful cycle in nature. Now, it doesn't modify the climate, it modifies one's behavior in order to live in the existing climate, and that is a very great difference, understanding nature so that one can modify one's own behavior and survive. Obviously these are opinions, and you have to make your own opinion about whether we can continue this way of converting natural resources into materials that are irreversibly unrecyclable. So we create plastics or products that stay in the ground forever, and we are obviously taking material from somewhere and exporting them somewhere, or locally converting it into something that cannot be necessarily recycled back. or reused in a proper way. So we are obviously depleting natural resources, whether it's minerals or whether it's soil or whether it's ocean fish, forests, and so on and so forth. Okay, some of them can be preserved, restored, and managed, but some of them cannot be. So the book lists a bunch of synthesis of the effects of warming in certain ranges and associated CO2 concentration levels. I will show another figure of how the IPCC AR6 looks at this impacts in terms of its defined special ecosystems, threatened systems, and so on and so forth. So it's worth going through these, since the book provides a nice summary of papers. We are not talking about the uncertainties associated with these, so just keep in mind that these are potential negative effects of warming. So in the 1 to 3 degree C range, with CO2 levels reaching 380 to 550 ppm, remembering we are already at 420 some ppm, maybe 423 or so, the effects can go through agricultural yields, shortages of water for drinking, agriculture, and energy. Steppe regions around the world will experience greater drought, generating water stress and crop failure. Northern Hemisphere will experience larger crop yields in some regions, so there will be winners and losers. Cold climates that get warmer will experience longer growing seasons and larger crop yields. 1/10 of global ecosystem will lose between 2 to 47% of their extent. These are estimates, and you have to be sure where they came from and what kind of uncertainties are associated with them. The Great Karoo grass flats in South Africa will shrink. The Queensland rainforest in Australia will potentially lose 50% of its extent. The Dryanda forest of Australia will experience species extinctions. Kalahari dune fields will become activated. Desertification. Oceans will become more acidified, as we talked about, with negative impacts on corals. Higher incidence of flooding in low-lying areas around the world. Many island states are seriously worried about this. If we go to 1.5 to 2.5 degrees C with CO2 levels at 400 to 500 ppm, so you can see the overlap here, 380 to 550, but here we are saying 400 to 500. So this obviously depends on the pathways we talked about, shared socioeconomic pathways, mitigation efforts, renewable energy efforts, reducing our footprints in many other ways through transportation, electric vehicles, electrification of everything, and so on and so forth. So plant and animal species will face extinction. Greenland ice sheet may begin to melt, and associated sea level rise can be as high as 7 meters. Clean fresh water will be increasingly unavailable because of droughts and flooding. Too much water or too little water in terms of extreme events. Water availability is expected to fall between 10 to 30% in dry regions and mid-latitudes. By 2020, we're already in 2022. This book was written before. Between 75 and 200 million people in Africa will experience water stress, and rain-fed agriculture could decline by as much as 50%. One can go back and check if this has happened, but obviously number of people experiencing water stress has gone up seriously, and rain-fed agriculture has dropped, crop yields have dropped, which is also a combination of things like increasing tropospheric ozone and so on related to emissions and pollution. In Asia, more than 1 billion people will face reductions in fresh water and be vulnerable to flooding. At 2 degrees C, 450 ppm, again an estimate, so you have to be very careful. Between 1 and 2.8 billion people will have trouble getting drinking water. 97% of the coral reefs in the world will die. Again, this is an estimate that one has to watch, especially because some corals are responding well, at least they are not withering away and dying in warm temperatures. 16% of the world's ecosystems will be transformed between 5 and 60% with between 5 and 66% losing some of their extent. Rising sea levels already happening, cyclones already affected, but there is a big debate about total number is increasing or just the more intense ones are increasing, and where: Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and so on. So obviously that will affect coastal populations. Beyond 2 degrees centigrade, where we'll be more than 450 ppm of CO2 concentration, cereal crop yields will be affected, displacements of people in Africa, loss of summer ice in Arctic, which is something to watch for, which may happen in next decade or so, and not everybody will be sorry about it because there's fuel under it. There's pathway from Atlantic to Pacific that'll open up if this happens. Okay, 30% of the polar bear population will decline by 2050. Predicted 60% decline in the lemming population. Declines in the stability of Arctic tundra with permafrost consequences, endangering Arctic shorebirds and geese. Obviously, as I said, polar bears are responding differently in some regions of Greenland, so we have to watch out how biology always finds a way to survive sometimes, or always, I don't know. In the Americas, vector-borne diseases. So the disease, mosquito populations and tropical diseases will spread to higher latitudes, which is already happening with Lyme disease and dengue and chikungunya and so on. Interregional tensions will likely mount in Russia when crop productivity falls as temperatures continue to rise. While Russia has invaded Ukraine, and that has affected food exports, wheat export from Ukraine, gas export from Russia. Germany is firing up coal plants to deal with it. Grain prices have gone up. Countries like India are under pressure to export grains, which they don't want to do, and so on. In Asia, 1.4 to 4.2 billion people will face water shortages. Vector-borne diseases will start appearing further north and south. China is expected to lose half its boreal forest. Sundarbans in Bangladesh will also disappear. Australia, threat of extinction will expand, and the Kakadu wetland will be lost. Half of the Kakadu wetland will be lost. You get the idea. I'm just reading them because I wanted to think of the range of possibilities despite the uncertainties in these conclusions. 2.2 to 3 degrees C, 450 to 550 ppm. Atlantic meridional overturning circulation will be reduced by about 1/3. High uncertainty there, but already there is an impact noticed. Amazon rainforest will collapse. Not everybody will agree on that. Hundreds of millions of people will suffer from increasing water shortage. Water shortage is going to be something to watch out for across the board, and whether that will be dealt with desalination and other water harvesting methods, managed agriculture with agroforestry and so on, and so need to be seen. Between 20 and 30% of plant and animal species will be at risk of extinction. Coming back to Africa, 80% of the Karoo grass flats will be potentially lost, endangering 2,800 plants. 5 of South Africa's parks will lose more than 40% of their animals. Fisheries will be lost in Malawi. 3/4 of South Africa's crops will end in failure. And all of the dune fields in Kalahari will be active, threatening the ecosystems and agriculture of the Sub-Sahara, which happens to be one of the most vulnerable places in the world. At the same temperature range, maple trees, the source of Canada's world-renowned maple syrup, will be threatened. In Australia, the Kakadu wetlands and alpine zone will be lost. The Tibetan Plateau in Asia will undergo desertification and a shift in the permafrost. Chinese boreal forests could disappear. Okay, I think I have a couple of more, so we'll wrap those up in this podcast. So above 3 degrees centigrade, Tibetan Plateau again, Chinese boreal forest again. GDP of 65 countries will fall by 16%. This is noted in many ways in many reports about the impacts on GDP, which is something that has to be watched for carefully, especially for countries like China and India, which are ambitious on how much they want to grow their GDPs and get better quality of life and standards of living for their citizens. Malaria continues to expand. Dengue exposed will more than half of the world's population will be exposed to dengue, compared to 1/3 in 1990. 4 degrees C, we're getting into very high levels of CO2 at 700 ppm. So entire regions will be unable to produce agricultural crops, resulting in more people at risk of hunger. Australia no longer will be able to produce agricultural crops, and alpine zones will be lost. Africa, 70 to 80% of the human population will face hunger. In Russia, 5 to 12% drop in agricultural production is predicted to occur over 14 to 41% of the country's agricultural regions. 38% of the alpine species are projected to lose 90% of their range in Europe. Malarian regions will expand, perennial zones will disappear, taiga producing regions will lose more than 40% of their cover. Tundra regions will potentially be reduced by 60%. But what happens to the warming and the regions exposed here, whether ecosystem will adjust and agriculture can be more productive and so on. So again, one has to see which are the regions that will lose and which are the regions that will gain. Timber production will increase, North Atlantic thermal land circulation will slow significantly, and if we go to 450 to 775 ppm with a range of warming from 2 to 4.5 degrees C, 20 to 400 million ton reduction in global cereal production, up to 400 million additional people at risk of hunger. 70 to 80% of those people will be in Africa. So how do these climate perturbations affect overall the global interconnected trade and economy, and how Africans themselves will respond to such climate perturbations, as we have seen what happened in the past, right, out of Africa scenarios. An additional 1.2 to 3 billion people will suffer from water stress. There's a 50% chance that West Antarctic ice sheet will begin to melt. This is something to be watched for, with serious global sea level rise consequences. 1/3 of the global coastal wetlands will be lost. In the Americas, half of the world's migratory bird habitat will potentially be lost. In the same range, alpine species in Europe and Russia are projected to be near extinction, along with 70% of the Mediterranean species. In China, rice yields may fall by 10 to 20%. Australia is predicted to lose half of its eucalyptus, and of course you know that the koala bears depend very much on those, and it's part of a rich biodiversity and ecosystem. Okay, so I didn't read all the details, but I just wanted to give you the range of food production issues, ecosystems and vegetation issues, health issues, water issues, and of course there will be associated energy issues, and this is something that humans have to prepare for in terms of mitigation and adaptation. In the next podcast, we will see how IPCC AR6 looks at the impacts of future warming scenarios on different systems. They have a slightly simplified graphical way of showing these with levels of confidence, with different levels of warming. So that's worth looking at in the next podcast. Okay.